Rufus R. Dawes was no ordinary officer. At just 24 years old, he commanded the Sixth Wisconsin Infantry, part of the famed Iron Brigade, known for its discipline, fierce fighting, and unmatched endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. A man of principle and resolve, Dawes did not fight for fame, but for duty and the preservation of the Union. What follows is his first-hand account of the first day at the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the turning points of the American Civil War. This narrative has been lightly edited for clarity and flow, but remains faithful to Dawes's original voice and the historical record he left behind. It is not a polished memoir written long after the fact. It is the honest, unfiltered recollection of a battlefield commander. Dawes brings us into the thick of the fighting, the sound of musket fire along the Cashtown Pike, the deadly charge on the railroad cut, the chaos of retreat through Gettysburg streets, and the final exhausted stand on Cemetery Hill. On July 1, 1863, Rufus Dawes and the men of the Sixth Wisconsin stood against superior numbers and held the line. This is their story. When General James S. Wadsworth's division of the 1st Army Corps marched toward Gettysburg on the morning of July 1, 1863, the 6th Wisconsin was the last regiment in the order of march. The brigade guard, 2 officers and 100 men, marched immediately behind us. That is why they were assigned to our regiment when we became involved in battle. We moved along the Emmitsburg Road. 340 officers and enlisted men marched in our ranks. All were in the highest spirits. To make a show in the streets of Gettysburg, I brought the drum corps to the front and unfurled our colors. The drum major, R.N. Smith, struck up "The Campbells Are Coming," and the regiment closed ranks and swung into step. That was when we first heard the thunder of enemy cannon firing upon General Buford's cavalry. The troops ahead turned off the road, crossing the fields to the left of Gettysburg, heading toward Seminary Ridge. We stopped our music, though it had stirred the martial spirit of old John Burns, and turned toward the grim work of war. As the head of our regimental column reached the crest of Seminary Ridge, an aide from General Meredith's staff, Lieutenant Gilbert M. Woodward, galloped up with an order: "Colonel, form your line and prepare for action." I wheeled my horse and gave the necessary commands. The line was formed at a double quick, the men loading their muskets as they ran. We rushed forward to take our place on the left flank of the Iron Brigade. Regiment after regiment of our brigade was already plunging into McPherson's woods. Suddenly, another aide, Lieutenant Martin, rode up. "Colonel," he said, "General Doubleday is now in command of the 1st Corps, and he directs that you halt your regiment." General John F. Reynolds had been killed, but that fact was not disclosed to us then. I halted the regiment and ordered the men to lie down. At that moment, the brigade guard reported to me for duty in the battle to come. I divided them into 2 companies of 50 men each, placing them on the right and left flanks of the regiment. These men represented every regiment in the Iron Brigade, 20 from each. The 2 officers, Lieutenant Lloyd G. Harris of the 6th Wisconsin and Lieutenant Levi Showalter of the 2nd Wisconsin, were competent, steady leaders. 81 men from other Iron Brigade regiments were thus, in the emergency of sudden and unexpected battle, added to our ranks. Now 2 brigades from each army faced off. Archer's brigade confronted the Iron Brigade. Joseph R. Davis's brigade opposed Cutler's brigade of Wadsworth's division. Hall's battery accompanied Cutler's line. Except for the 6th Wisconsin, Wadsworth's entire division was already hotly engaged with the enemy. Then came Lieutenant Meredith Jones with another order from General Doubleday: "Move your regiment at once to the right." I gave the command to march double quick in that direction. Captain J.D. Wood joined me, repeating the order and warning that the rebels were driving Cutler's men. From our position, we could see Hall's guns limbering up and retreating. Cutler's troops were clearly falling back in disorder. As we hurried on, we passed several officers carrying a body wrapped in a blanket, General Reynolds. We did not yet know he had been shot. Suddenly, my horse reared and plunged. I did not realize she had been hit. I pulled the reins tight and spurred her forward, but she dropped heavily onto her haunches. I was thrown sprawling in front of the regiment. The men gave a hearty cheer. The old mare staggered to her feet and hobbled off on 3 legs. A minie-ball had struck her in the breast, traveled 17 inches through her body, and lodged behind her left shoulder. She carried that bullet for years, though her temper never recovered. From then on, I fought the battle on foot. The regiment halted at a fence running along the Cashtown Turnpike. I gave the order to fire. Out in the field beyond the road, a long line of yelling Confederates could be seen rushing forward, firing as they came. Our own troops from Cutler's brigade were fleeing back in disorder. But the fire from our carefully aimed muskets, resting steady on the fence rails, struck the enemy's flank and soon brought their pursuit to a stop. The rebel line swayed, then buckled. They suddenly stopped firing and dashed into what we discovered was a railroad cut running parallel to the Cashtown Turnpike. I ordered my men to climb the fences in advance. At that moment, I did not know the cut existed, and I mistook the enemy's move as a retreat. But that illusion was shattered by the deadly volley they opened up from their cover. Captain John Tickner, always a daring leader, was shot dead while climbing the second fence. Many more were hit along the fence line. Still, the line pressed on. Once we cleared the fences and entered the open field, Under a storm of fire, I saw the 95th New York coming gallantly into line on our left. I did not know or care where they came from, only that I was glad to see them. Farther left stood the 14th Brooklyn, though I didn't know that at the time either. Major Edward Pye seemed to command the 95th. I ran to the major. "We must charge," I said. "Charge it is," he replied. "Forward, charge," I shouted. Major Pye echoed the command. We were under a punishing invisible fire from men hidden in the cut. Our soldiers were falling in large numbers. The only way I could hold the line together was to shout again and again, "A line on the colors, close up on the colors, close up on the colors." The colors fell multiple times, but every time they were raised again by the brave men of the color guard. Of the 420 who began the charge from the turnpike fence, about 240 made it to the railroad cut. Years later, I measured that distance. It was 175 paces. Every officer did his duty, brave, steady, and focused. But the real force driving the charge came from the sheer determination of the enlisted men. I remember the long arms of Captain J.H. Marston of Company E, stretched wide as if to sweep his men forward. He rose to his full height at a key moment. He was the tallest man in the regiment, except for Levi Stedman of Company 1, who was killed in the charge. How the rebels missed Marston, I cannot say. Second Lieutenant O.B. Chapman of Company C fell dead during the charge. Lieutenant Thomas Kerr, commanding Company D, would later receive his captain's commission dated July 1st in recognition of his bravery. From behind the edge of the railroad cut, the rebel colors waved defiantly. Several of our men became fixated on seizing them. Corporal Eggleston of Company H rushed forward to grab the flag and was shot down, mortally wounded. Private Anderson, enraged at his comrade's death, cared little for the flag itself. Swinging his musket with deadly strength, he split the skull of the rebel who had fired on Eggleston. That man was known throughout our regiment as Rocky Mountain Anderson. Lieutenant William N. Remington was shot in the shoulder while making his own run at the colors. Into this chaos came Corporal Francis A. Waller, who seized the Confederate flag and held it fast. For that act, Congress awarded him a medal. His name will live on in history. My first clear sign that we had reached the enemy came not from what I saw, but from what I heard. A general cry from our men rising in unison, "Throw down your muskets! Down with your muskets!" I rushed forward, pushing through our line. Suddenly, I found myself standing at the edge of the railroad cut, looking down on hundreds of Confederate soldiers packed below. Where I stood, the cut was about 4 feet deep. Adjutant Brooks, quick and composed, placed 20 men across the cut to fire into it if needed. I have often looked back and wonder at the discipline and restraint our men showed in that moment. A general volley would have slaughtered the enemy where they stood, but it never came. I shouted, "Where is the colonel of this regiment?" A Confederate officer wearing stars on his collar looked up and replied, "Who are you?" "I command this regiment," I answered. "Surrender, or I will fire." He did not speak again. He simply handed me his sword. His men, those still holding muskets, threw them down at once. That moment of cool control spared at least 100 lives. The fighting around the rebel colors continued even as this surrender unfolded. I took the sword. I could have said, "Keep your sword, sir." That would have been the gentlemanly gesture. But I was new to such moments, and when 6 more officers stepped forward and handed me their swords, I took those too. I stood awkwardly holding an armful of Confederate sabers until Adjutant Brooks came to relieve me of them. I ordered the officer in charge, Major John A. Blair of the 2nd Mississippi Regiment, to have his men fall in without arms. He obeyed without hesitation. 7 officers and 225 enlisted men followed his command. I assigned Major John F. Hauser to march the prisoners to the Provost Guard. Then Lieutenant William Golterman of Company F volunteered to lead a skirmish line, which I quickly called for. His men pushed forward to secure the ridge and guard against any counterattack. One of Hall's guns, belonging to the 2nd Maine Battery, had been abandoned on the field between the lines. After the surrender, Captain Roland P. Converse took enough men to recover it. They hauled it back to the turnpike, where Captain Hall resumed command of the piece. Corporal Francis A. Waller, the one who had captured the enemy flag, brought it to me. It was the battle flag of the 2nd Mississippi Volunteers, one of the oldest and proudest regiments in the Confederate Army. It belonged to the brigade commanded by Joseph R. Davis, nephew of Jefferson Davis. Battlefield rules forbade sound men from leaving the ranks, but Sergeant William Evans of Company H had been wounded badly in both thighs and could only move with 2 muskets for crutches. To him I entrusted the captured flag. I removed it from its staff and wrapped it around his body. Adjutant Brooks strapped on one of the captured swords, and he still owns it to this day. The remaining 6 swords were given to a wounded man and handed over to our chief surgeon, a W. Preston. Unfortunately, when the enemy later captured our hospital, they took those swords. No blame to the doctor. His hands were full caring for the wounded. With the prisoners secured and the field momentarily quiet, the charge had ended. Our comrades in the Iron Brigade, who had stormed McPherson's woods earlier, had already routed Archer's brigade, captured their general, and many of his men. They had shifted position to support Cutler, but our victory at the railroad cut made that unnecessary. Joseph R. Davis's brigade was scattered or captured. We had defeated a superior force, veterans from General Lee's army, on an open field. It was a short, savage fight, and the honors clearly went to the boys in blue. While our regiment was reorganizing, Sergeant William Evans, who had been entrusted with the rebel flag, hobbled toward Gettysburg, weak and faint from loss of blood. He collapsed in the street. Two kind-hearted young women brought him into their home and placed him on a bed. As Union troops began retreating through the town in confusion, the cheers of the pursuing Confederates echoed louder. Fearing the flag would be discovered, Evans begged his caretakers to hide it. They cut a hole in the bed tick beneath him, placed the flag inside, and sewed it shut. It remained hidden there until the Confederates withdrew. On the morning of July 4th, Evans brought the flag safely to me on Culp's Hill. General Doubleday later wrote that when Cutler's regiments were overpowered and driven back, the moment was a critical one, involving the defeat, perhaps the utter rout of our forces. Later that day, we marched through the railroad cut again. About 1,000 enemy muskets lay scattered in the bottom. Only one regiment, the 2nd Mississippi Volunteers, had surrendered as a unit. The 95th New York and the 14th Brooklyn also took prisoners. All the troops in the cut either surrendered or ran out the far end. General Wadsworth ordered us to advance to the ridge west of Seminary Ridge. There we encountered a line of rebel skirmishers. We opened fire and drove them back into Willoughby Run. But soon Confederate artillery positioned just south of the Cashtown Turnpike opened up on us with 6 guns. Shells burst overhead and around us in great numbers. I ordered the men to lie down beneath the ridge to avoid casualties. The Iron Brigade held McPherson's Woods half a mile to our left. Between us and them were Colonel Roy Stone's Pennsylvania Bucktails. General Cutler's brigade was now on our right. At about 1:30 in the afternoon, the combined corps of Hill and Ewell launched a full attack. The Bucktails bore the brunt of it. They were fighting on their own Pennsylvania soil, and their conduct was not only heroic, it was glorious. The charges and countercharges that followed are hard to describe. I remember seeing the banner of the 149th Pennsylvania planted defiantly between the two battle lines as the fighting raged on. Eventually, that flag was captured by the enemy. Under the weight of the attack, the entire Union line began falling back towards Seminary Ridge. I had a clear view of the movement. I saw Captain Holland Richardson, acting as aide to Colonel W.W. Robinson, then in command of the Iron Brigade, riding with the colors of the 7th Wisconsin raised high as the brigade slowly withdrew from McPherson's Woods. We received no orders. As a detached regiment, we had likely been overlooked, but I could see the enemy advancing to a position where they would soon sweep the ground between us and Seminary Ridge with musket and artillery fire. Marching across that field in formation would have cost us many lives. I adopted the same tactic the rebels had used that morning. I ordered the men to run into the railroad cut. Once inside, I directed them to follow me in single file. We moved at a run, from our position to another cut along Seminary Ridge. Dirt exploded all around us as rebel shells plowed into the ground, but miraculously not a single man was hit. Once we reached cover, the ranks were quickly reformed, and we marched into the woods atop Seminary Ridge, returning to the same ground from which we had launched our earlier attack. Now, the entire 1st Corps stood in line of battle on Seminary Ridge. There, that veteran body of soldiers made a last heroic stand to hold the enemy back. Battery B, 4th United States Artillery, under Lieutenant James Stewart, arrived. General Wadsworth ordered me to support the battery with my regiment. Stewart was one of the bravest and most capable officers I ever saw in battle. His guns were manned by volunteers, many from our own brigade. And then came the grand Confederate assault. I stood among Stewart's guns as the enemy advanced. Along Seminary Ridge, the Iron Brigade and the Bucktails lay together in one long line, flat on their bellies. Across the open field in front of us, the long gray lines of the Army of Northern Virginia swept forward, steady, precise, magnificent. Some regimental flags were carried well ahead of the lines. Stewart fired shell until the enemy reached the ridge east of Willoughby Run. Then they charged. Our line opened up with a storm of musket fire. Stewart's gunners, moving like clockwork, poured canister into the advancing ranks. The Confederates came halfway down the slope, hesitated, began to fire, then broke and ran. Our men howled after them, "Come on, Johnny, come on!" But they came again, this time slower, more cautious, and opened a steady fire from the outset. That musketry was deadly. It killed many of Stewart's men and horses. Still, his battery fired on without pause. Lieutenant Clayton E. Rogers, aide on General Wadsworth's staff, came riding toward me at speed. Leaning down from his saddle, he spoke quietly. "The orders, Colonel, are to retreat beyond the town. Hold your men together." I was stunned. The cheers of defiance along our line on Seminary Ridge had barely faded. But one glance to our right and rear made the reason clear. There, the troops of the 11th Corps were in full retreat. Long lines of Confederate soldiers, with fluttering banners and gleaming bayonets, were sweeping forward in pursuit without resistance. It was a race to reach Gettysburg, us or them. I faced the regiment to the rear and gave the command to march in line of battle across the open fields toward town. We were north of the railroad, separated from the rest of our corps. If we had wanted to attack Ewell's 20,000 men with our 200, we could not have picked a more direct route. We knew nothing of Cemetery Hill. All we could see was that the enemy's lines were forming a horseshoe around us. Still, with the flags of the Union and of Wisconsin held high, our little regiment marched firmly and steadily. As we neared Gettysburg, the buildings of Pennsylvania College briefly shielded us from enemy view. That's when we realized most of our troops were retreating at a right angle to our path. We reached a street that ran from the college toward Cemetery Hill and crossed it. Now directly in front of the enemy, I turned the regiment toward the hill, though at the time I did not know what it was. The first cross street was swept by enemy musket fire. A tight board fence enclosed a barnyard on the opposite side. Someone had knocked out a couple of boards, creating what the men called a hog hole. I took one of the colors, dashed across the street, and dove through the hole. "Follow in single file, on the run," I ordered. Officers and men followed fast. I stationed myself at the fence, clearing the way. If a man blocked the opening, I yanked him aside without ceremony. 2 were shot while crossing the street. The regiment reformed in the barnyard. Then I led them back to the main street leading from the college to the hill. Scattered single-file runners had been less exposed to fire, and the barnyard allowed us to regroup in tight order. That had been the point of the maneuver, to keep the regiment together, as ordered. The heat was stifling. Sweat poured from every face. The men's canteens had been dry for hours. The streets were jammed with retreating soldiers, ambulances, wagons, and artillery. Cellars were full of able-bodied men too cowardly to stand, waiting to surrender. I saw no badges of the First Corps among that disgraceful crowd. In one case, these miscreants mistook us for Confederates and shouted from the cellar, "Don't fire, Johnny, we'll surrender." The sight of them sickened my hot, thirsty men. Finding our path blocked, I formed the regiment in 2 lines across the street. Enemy fire now came from houses and nearby lots. Just then, help came from an unexpected quarter, an elderly citizen, carrying 2 buckets of cold water. No one but a soldier could understand what that gift meant. After drinking, I called out. The men responded with 3 cheers for the cause we stood for. The enemy fired at us from nearby houses. We fired back wherever they showed themselves. The exchange had one benefit. It cleared the street of stragglers. With the way open, we resumed our march toward Cemetery Hill. The enemy did not pursue. They had discovered it was a costly business. Still, we did not know whether we were marching into safety or into a trap. But ahead of us, at last, we saw the colors of the Union waving over a disciplined line of blue-clad men. It was the 73rd Ohio of Steinwehr's division, 11th Corps. With renewed strength, we rushed forward. Their line opened to receive us. Officers and men of the 6th Wisconsin collapsed, exhausted, on the grass and among the graves of the cemetery. At that moment, the situation on Cemetery Hill was precarious. If fresh Confederate troops had attacked, things could have gone badly. Troops were scattered and disordered. Stragglers and wounded streamed down the Baltimore Turnpike toward the rear. But panic never took hold. After only a short rest, I gave the order to fall in, and my men obeyed. Lieutenant Rogers returned with orders from General Wadsworth. We were to rejoin our brigade on Culp's Hill. As we marched, our regimental wagon met us. Inside were a dozen spades and shovels. We took position on the right of our brigade and began to dig in. There had been no formal order to build breastworks, but the situation made their necessity obvious. The men worked in relays. One would dig with all his strength until he was winded, then another would grab the spade and keep at it. At last, the regiment lay down to rest, their bodies worn but their spirit unbroken. That night brought sad reflection. Our dead lay unburied beyond our reach. Our wounded were in enemy hands. The bravest among us were gone. Of the 1,800 men who had marched with the Iron Brigade that morning, only 700 remained. More than 1,000 had been shot. The numbers were not abstract, they were personal. We had been driven from the field. Our commander was dead. And yet, despite all of this, we had held Cemetery Hill. That stand forced the decision that Gettysburg would be the place where the greatest battle of the war would be fought.